Mam nadzieję, że działa. Tak, działa. Witam wszystkich Państwa. Rozumiem, że jesteśmy w nieco szczuplejszym gronie niż normalnie. Welcome everybody. I'm happy that notwithstanding all those festivities, you arrive here. I welcome also our viewers through internet who are far away. I'm very happy that today we have a special host, special speaker, Professor Paul from Germany, one of the best German sinologists, and I suppose the best specialist of dialogue among civilization in Germany. In the past, we collaborated together organizing conferences in Warsaw at the very beginning of our new century about dialogue among civilizations. I would like to emphasize that in the last volume of Asia Pacific 21st, there is a paper by Professor Paul about death and life according to Chinese opinions, so please look at the volume of Asia Pacific. And I hope that in this 22nd we will have another paper, general debate on China, on the Chinese system. As an introduction to his speech, his presentation, I would like to say a few words as usually. As you see in our media, dominate the vision that China is a communist country. This propaganda started owing to the efforts of Taiwan mostly, since Taiwanese propaganda considered that in China nothing changed after death of Mao with Deng Xiaoping. It is still a communist country, so go down with the communism and so on. So I would like to emphasize that the essential element of communism, without which communism is impossible, it's so-called social ownership of the means of production. It means that the state has monopoly and dominance in economy, that all the production is in the hands of the government and distribution is also in the hands of the government. When there is free market, there is no communism. That's very simple. And the second, where there is free market, they are bourgeois or billionaires, millionaires and billionaires. As you know, in China, there are more billionaires counted in dollars than in the States. Differences, economic differences in China are also greater than in the States, closer to Latin American standards. So when I was in China to do many times during the reforms, and I saw poor people on the streets begging, old invalids and so on, when peasants were talking me how expensive is primary school, how does not work public service of health. If you have no money, then you have no access to health service. Yes, those main problems are slowly, step by step, resolved. China is passing from a jungle, white capitalism, which we had in Europe in the 19th century, into more civilized capitalist system. Of course, there is a party which is called Communist Party, but as Professor Lynn W. White from Princeton University, as he called it, the acronym Chinese Communist Party should be read instead Chinese Capitalist Party, because it constructed capitalist system, very brutal capitalist system. Although there are some quotation from Marx and from Mao. So Chinese traditions, political traditions, are quite different from the West. Confucianism is not only an ideology, but that's also an ethos of the citizens, of the society. So it survives much longer than official acceptance of Confucianism. Sometimes when somebody asks me about the nature of the Maoist system, which I saw myself, I studied under Mao in China, in Peking University. So I saw the very beginning of Cultural Revolution, which started at the Peking University. So my conclusion is that Maoist system was, let's say, 70% Confucian, 15% Soviet, and 15%, let's say, Chinese communist traditions. So the essential future, essential concept, principles of Chinese communism were not communist, they were Confucian. Although we may say that this Maoist Confucianism was heretic Confucianism, because for Confucianism, real Confucianism, harmony is essential. And in Mao interpretation, there was class struggle. So without harmony, you can't call it real Confucianism. So it was a kind of heretic Confucianism. But still, Mao was a Confucian sage, king, emperor, ruling China with the moral improvement of the citizens and so on, according to Confucian standards. We may say that that all those models, Maoist models, personal models, were deeply Confucian in nature. So, of course, China is changing. Looking on China only through Confucian lens, it would be wrong. But this lens is necessary. There is also some references to Marxism. Marxism quite often read in a new way. We have various new Marxists, but I would like to emphasize that some of new Marxists and some of new Maoists are in prison. And about them, you can't read in Western newspapers. About defenders of human rights, you may read in Western newspapers. About Marxists or new Maoists who try to organize workers to defend their interests and so on, you can't read in Western newspapers. So, but in a way, also President Xi Jinping, as I understand, he tries to return a little bit to this Marxist tradition with a new interpretation. But please remember that the cult of Mao and memory of Maoist period with very diffuse, that's very strong force. It does not depend only on the Communist Party, on Politburo. It is, I would say, these pro-Maoist tendencies are from grassroots level going up, and the leadership has to consider that as a reality. And democracy, yes, I agree with Professor Paul that democracy is a serious problem in China. We got revival, maybe birth of democracy in villages from the grassroots level, real democracy with elections and so on, very dynamic, and in local scale, quite revolutionary, very often. Plus, on the national level, there is a new concept that the political system of China, it's consultative democracy. It means democracy based on consultations in order to elaborate harmony, because now with revival of Confucianism, we return again to harmony. And during many international events, this character, significant harmony, is shown everywhere, shown to the foreigners. But please remember that the idea of harmony, social harmony, political harmony, harmony between mankind and nature and so on, it's diffused in all post-Confucian countries, in Japan, in Korea, in Vietnam as well, so, and perhaps to a certain degree in other East Asian countries. So, from my point of view, China is searching for her way, and she, in the near future, will not copy any Western system. China will be not democratic in an American way, since for 3,000 years, China has its own particular system. And in the future, she will have also her own particular political system, different from the European and from American. And we should accept this as a reality, without false expectation that China will copy the best in the world American democratic system. You may see how does it operate, how does it operate with President Trump and so on, and his other person. We complain so much about democracy in Europe, how it is changes and so on. So we must not be so arrogant that consider that everything what was invented in Europe, it must be accepted by all the people in the world, because they are wrong expectations. Thank you very much. Professor Paul will take the floor and present you some his ideas and observations of many times. I would like for the Poles that his Trier University, in Polish we call it Trewir. It is from Latin, from the old Latin name. Sometimes with German towns we have problems because we know the old names, Latin names, and then we understand. And it is a small detail, but interesting. Maybe somebody of you remember that Marx was from Trier, so it is also Marx's original place. Thank you very much. Floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Gawlikowski, for this kind introduction. When I listened to your intro, I had a feeling you had already a glimpse at my paper. You precluded a lot of things that I will say too, but you could also say great minds think alike. We have a lot of similar views. It's my great pleasure and it's my great honor to be here. For me, it's the second time that I'm in Warsaw. First time about 20 years ago, I participated at that time at a great conference, big conference on cross-cultural dialogue. And at that time we first met, and I'm very happy that our friendship, our collegial friendship, had stood the time, stood the times, you know, like the test of times. That's the expression. So nice to see Professor Gawlikowski still in full vigor. Now we are both retired. 20 years ago we were a little younger. Very happy. Okay. So much been said, then I will turn to my paper now. I will talk about the Confucian tradition, and as you all know, the Confucian tradition is quite old. It is older than Christianity. It's 500 years older, and it had a great impact on not only on China, but also on the surrounding countries such as Japan, Korea, Vietnam. And in many ways, the impact is comparable to the teachings of Christianity, and also, of course, to Greek and Roman philosophy. The nucleus of the Confucian teachings are the scriptures, the so-called 5 books, the 5 classics and the 4 books. And my focus will be tonight, what do the Chinese classics say about the order of society? What do they say about public philosophy, or as political philosophy, as we call it also today? And what are the repercussions of these scriptures until today? And just jump ahead. And this is the content of my paper. So I will first deal with Confucianism as a tradition of political thought. I will go into things such as people-based thought, Chinese like Minben, then humane rule, harmony, unity of politics and morality, principles of an ideal society and government. And the second part will deal especially with Confucianism and Marxism, and the last part with Confucianism and democracy. So first part, people-based thought. I only want to give you one quote representative of this whole idea from the Book of Documents, one of the so-called 5 classics. It says, "It was the lesson of our great ancestor. The people should be cherished and not looked down upon. The people are the root of a country. If the root is firm, the country is at peace." Yeah? I could give you a couple of more quotes like this from the Book of Documents, but for time's sake, I will just be brief. And will also mention that we have a similar quotation or similar position in the works of Mencius. Mencius, as you might know, is the second most important representative of the Confucian tradition, 4th to 3rd century BC. And here you have the quote, "The people are the most important element in a nation. The spirits of the land and grain are the next. The sovereign is the lightest." Yeah? The people are the most important element. The sovereign, the king, is the lightest. Because of this saying in the Book of Mencius, the Book of Mencius was at times in history purged or forbidden by certain emperors. But for example, the first emperor of the Ming dynasty, he took it out of traffic because it was too subversive, too dangerous. Anyways, we have here the emphasis that the government ideally should be for the welfare of the people. And from this kind of, from such quotes, you get the message of a people-based thought, as the Chinese call it, a political teaching that's just called people-based thought, Minbensixiang. The second point was humane rule. So again, turning to Mencius, his book was actually very, very influential in the history of Chinese thought. And he differentiates between two ways of government. And here's the quote. He says, "He who using force makes a pretense to benevolence is a hegemon. He who using virtue practices benevolence is the sovereign of the kingdom." So you have two ways. You have the way of the hegemon, as the Chinese call it, the Ba Dao, which is inhumane, which is cruel government, and you have the way of the king, the Wang Dao, which is humane rule for the welfare of the people. And humane rule in Chinese is called Ren Zheng. Ren, the most important virtue of Confucianism, being humane. And how this thought of humane rule has kind of spread over the borders of China into the neighboring countries. You see here from Royal Hall in the Royal Palace in Seoul, in Korea. It's called Renzheng Dian, the Hall of Humane Government. So this is here you see how people in Korea and Japan looked up to China for such concepts. The third important concept is harmony. As you might all know, Confucianism stresses a strict hierarchical social order. And from a Confucian point of view, it's only a reflection of a universal order, of a cosmological hierarchy, of a cosmological harmonious order, where heaven is above and earth is below. The opposite to this hierarchical order is chaos, which was always kind of being a big threat to the thinkers of old China. So consensus and harmony, of course, they offer social cohesion. And harmony is in a way important because China has not been an equal society. It's been, as I said, hierarchical. And the harmony makes the transition between the different levels, of course, a little smoother. So the main political goal was always to ensure a harmonious social order. How important the concept of harmony is, or was, I want to illustrate by the three main halls of the Imperial Palace. You know, most of you have already been to Beijing, and you've seen the Imperial Palace, the Forbidden City. The Forbidden City, roughly speaking, is separated into two parts. The back part, which is the private part of the emperor and his family and everything, and the front part, which he was used for conducting his business. And the front part is actually laid out in 3 layers, and the 3 layers are the 3 main halls, and they are called the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the Hall of Central Harmony, and the Hall of Preserving Harmony. These were the main halls in which the emperor conducted his daily business. Here, and they all have the character harmony in their title. Here's the Hall of Supreme Harmony, is the greatest, the largest hall in the Imperial Palace, and behind you've got the Hall of Central Harmony, or of the Middle and Harmony, which is of course in the middle, and in the very back is the Hall of Preserving Harmony. Only illustrating the importance of this concept in classical China, and for that reason also still today. Then now the fourth point was the unity of politics and morality. It is important to know that in classical China, the ideal means and the ideal goal of rule was a government through moral virtue of the rulers. Moral virtue of the rulers, not moral virtue of the citizens, but moral virtue of the rulers. The moral virtue of the rulers should be kind of an example that's being taken up by the citizens, by the people. So only virtuous people were supposed to be apt to be leaders. In classical China, for that reason, laws were not so important, but what was important was to follow the rules of propriety. Propriety, the Chinese call it li, which is also in a word for li mao, like politeness, etiquette, and everything. So education was not so much gaining knowledge about all sorts of things, but education was similar to the old Greek academy of Plato and Aristotle, to cultivate the virtue of the people there, of the students there. So it was to encourage the goodness of the people. So seen from this perspective, morality was a very crucial component of ruling. And from there you get the saying that traditional China had a unity of politics and morality. The Chinese term is 政教合一. Now I get to the principles of an ideal society and government, and I will turn to some influential texts that are taken from another classical scripture, the Book of Rights, the Li Ji. And there's a chapter which is called The Evolution of Rights, and there you get the vision of a proto-socialist society, and also the vision of a government of the most capable in the country. And here is the little text. When the grand course, that's the Da Dao, the great course, when the grand course was pursued, the world was one community. 天下为公. Men of talents, virtue, and ability were chosen. Their words were sincere, and what they cultivated was harmony. Thus, men did not love their parents only, nor treat as children only their sons. They showed kindness and compassion to widows, orphans, childless men, and those who were disabled by disease, so that they were all sufficiently maintained. This was the period of what we call the grand unity, the Datong. Yeah? A very influential text, and the world as one community. You see it, for example, here. You might not see it quite clearly because it's too dark. It's above the entrance of Sun Yat-sen's mausoleum in Nanjing, Tianxia Weigong. Yeah? Or go here to Boston. There, the Chinatown. You enter Chinatown through an arch where you have Tianxia Weigong. Yeah? And if you would step now a little bit closer, and then you might notice that I'm wearing a tie. Yeah. And if you are able to read Chinese characters, you would notice that the text that I just kind of introduced to you is written on my tie, together with an English translation. A student of mine once found it by accident and gave it to me as a present. When I give a talk on these topics, I usually wear it like today. Now, the Chinese were smart people, they still are. They knew that this kind of vision of grand unity was an ideal that could not really be reached. And so the text that I just offered to you continues with these words: now that the grand course has fallen into disuse and obscurity, the kingdom is a family inheritance. 天下为家. Yeah. Everyone loves above all others his own parents and cherishes as children only his own sons. People accumulate articles and exert their strengths for their own advantage. It goes on now to say that there are still, though, great kings and emperors who emphasized on the concept for propriety, and for that reason you still have an age of small prosperity. Yeah? Xiaokang, it's called in Chinese. So here from these two little texts, you get very, very influential concepts, like the world as one community, a concept of grand unity, and the concept of small prosperity, Xiaokang, as a preliminary stage to grand unity. And it is interesting to know that small prosperity, or sometimes it's also translated as moderate well-being, became the political program of Deng Xiaoping, the great reformer in the post-Maoist era. Yeah? And a grand unity, the Datong, is a vision of a proto-socialist society which is possibly equivalent to the notion of communism. So what I want to show here, that we have today's political goals with explicit reference to classical Confucian scriptures. This is important to keep in mind from my point of view. So, and Professor Gawlikowski mentioned already the Confucian ethos. Yeah, I have depicted it now in these few quotations, but I would add two more quotes, which are, from my view, also very important to capture the Confucian ethos. The one is to have concern with the fate of the country and its people. In Chinese, 有国有民. This has been said of the great Chinese poet Du Fu of the Tang Dynasty, 7th, 8th century, that he showed this concern with the fate of the country and its people. And another saying, which is attributed to Fan Zhongyan in the Song Dynasty, to take responsibility for the well-being of the whole world. 以天下为己任. To take responsibility for the well-being of the whole world. Having said that much, I would like to emphasize that Confucian rule was not, of course, a government by the people, or to speak with Abraham Lincoln, you know, Gettysburg Address, maybe you have learned about that in school too, you know, government by the people, of the people, and for the people. But it used to be only a government for the people. So the intellectuals in the Confucian tradition, they should be concerned about the welfare of the people, should be there for the people. They were supposed to serve within the government, and they also ought to be loyal critics of moral misconduct of the emperor or the surroundings. So what we get from there, we have a tradition of a rule by an educated moral elite. Educated moral elite. And this was the self-understanding of the elite. They were the representative of the common people. They were selected through the civil service exams. You know, when the first Europeans heard about that in the Age of Enlightenment here, they were amazed. You know, they could not imagine something like that. Here in Europe, everything was governed by nobility and by clerics, by the church. And there in China, you had a country that was governed by people that came into office through an examination that was open to everyone. It was a revolutionary idea. So from this point of view, we can characterize the Chinese type of government as a meritocracy. Meritocracy. Yeah. The people governed the country who had the people who governed the country were in their position because they have gained some merits. Merits through an academic system, merits through their social virtues, their moral virtues, and they were entrusted with the governing of the country for the sake of the people. Yeah? So the participation of the people itself was never an issue. Quite contrary to the European tradition beginning with the Greek polis and democracy, yeah, or also in the Roman period. This is important to keep in mind. So when we look at Confucianism in the past and its actual phase and practice, then we have to, of course, acknowledge that Confucianism was and is still a rich pool of positive cultural, political, and ethical resources. But Confucianism was also an idealized type of teaching. And you have always the tension between ideal and reality, yeah? Ideal versus reality. The ideal was seldom matched. And so in German, we talked about the socialism that existed in the in GDR, in East Germany, and also in Poland. We characterize it real existierender Sozialismus. I don't know if you have a similar term in Polish, maybe you do. And der real existierende Konfuzianismus is something similar. So I translated it as actually existing Confucianism. It kind of did not match the ideal. And so you have, of course, also criticism of Confucianism. And the criticism was actually the leading theme of China's modernization, particularly in the so-called May 4th movement, which occurred around 1919. Yeah? And it kind of continued until the Cultural Revolution in the 60s. In a way, it's the kind of the epitome of this kind of criticism of Confucianism. So, although the criticism might be justified in many ways, we still want to kind of question the wholesale discarding of the traditional ethical resources. And today, a lot of Chinese thinkers are trying to rescue from the ashes what is there, because they consider it being very valuable, and they're trying to give it a new face, restoring it to a certain extent. And you can, of course, talk about the or if it makes sense to speak of political Confucianism today. There is a great controversy about it. Like, one of the major proponent or advocate of Confucianism, one of the greatest Chinese intellectuals of today, whom I know also very well, who've been to Trier on my invitation, Du Weiming, he opposes a political interpretation of Confucianism. He stresses that Confucianism is a spiritual tradition. The goal of Confucianism as a spiritual tradition is moral cultivation, what the Chinese call qiuyang. Yeah? And he points out the ominous interaction of Confucianism and politics in Chinese past. It doesn't want to have anything to do with that. But you have had people, and you still have people, that stress the political relevance of Confucianism. Sun Yat-sen was one of them, the founder of the Chinese Republic. He unfortunately died very early in 1925. He had the so-called three principles of the people: nation, rights, and welfare. Welfare, very important. Yeah, Minsheng, government for the people. He adapted, in a way, Western political thought and tried to adapt it for a Chinese Confucian environment. Today you have somebody who has become quite prominent as a political Confucianist. His name is Jiang Qing, not to confuse with Mao's widow, it's different characters. He has a book, Political Confucianism, The Changing Direction, Particularities, and Development of Contemporary Confucianism. It's already 15 years old. A major supporter of Jiang Qing's thought is a Canadian, a young Canadian who used to teach at Tsinghua University. He just moved to Jinan, to Shandong. His name is Daniel Bell, Daniel A. Bell. It's not to confuse with the famous sociologist Daniel Bell. And he has a book that I can only recommend to you if you don't know it. I find it most relevant. It's called The China Model, Political Meritocracy and the Limits of Democracy. It's a very, very inspiring book, let's put it that way. Now I get to the second point, Confucianism and Marxism. And here you have two sculptures by Confucius and of Karl Marx, by a Chinese artist. His name is Wu Weishan. He made both of them. Yeah? And this one was on Tiananmen Square for a couple of weeks, about 6-7 years ago. I happened to be in Beijing at that time, and I made that shot. Later on, it disappeared into a kind of a backyard of a museum around there. And anyways, it might reappear. It might reappear someday. I don't want to predict that, but it might. And here, this is the statue that Wu Weishan made for Trier, the town that I come from. Augusta Treverorum, the Latin term, and which happened to be the birthplace of Karl Marx. And this was given to Trier on the occasion of Marx's 200th birthday, which was last year, right? So we have now this great Marx statue in Trier. Only like by the way, I come from the town that Karl Marx was born in, but I was born in the town that the father of Karl Marx was born. So when I'm in China, I always point it out, and I get really double brownie points for that, you know. Well, you had your history with Marxism, so I don't need to tell you much about Marxism. You all know more about it than I do, probably. We talk about three sources of Marxism: English political economy, like Adam Smith, Ricardo, and all; French republicanism, but very important German idealist philosophy, in particularly the philosophy of Georg Friedrich Hegel. But Marxism is not a philosophy, but it's an economic and social political theory. It's an analysis and it's a critique of the development of capitalism. It's not an ethics. Yeah, I want to stress that here. Not an ethics. It is much rather a pseudo meta science claiming universal relevance. Yeah? Marx and Engels thought that they had discovered universal laws, like economic development laws, like natural laws, yeah, like the accumulation of capital and all that stuff. And Engels, his companion, has this very interesting article, which the title of which is "Socialism, Utopian and Scientific." Actually, the German title is even more telling. It tells you from utopian thought to a science. You know, Marxism is a science. They believed it to be a science. And I don't want to get into much more the complex development, particularly the development of Marxism, Leninism, although I will say a few words afterwards about that. Anyways, we have, since about 100 years, we have Marxism being the ideological basis of government in various countries, and I leave it up to you to say if that's been successful or not. What's important that Marxism was sinified, was adapted to Chinese conditions. Yeah? The Marxism that is practiced today in China, and was practiced today, is not the Marxism that sprung up in Trier. Yeah, definitely not. Edward Said, the famous philosopher, he came up with the idea of Orientalism, as you might know. He had the concept of traveling theories, you know, how theories traveling from one place to another and change according to the circumstances. One has to keep in mind that at the year 1921, when the Chinese Communist Party was founded, the works of Marx had hardly been known to China, and hardly anything been translated. One knew about Marxism through the October Revolution in Russia. And Mao, he became only acquainted with bits and pieces of Marx thought in the 1930s through a Stalinist interpretation. And it is interesting that Mao referred to an internationalist ideology for the purpose of a national and anti-colonialist liberation struggle. That was actually his task, you know, to lead a national and anti-colonialist liberation struggle. And for that purpose, he relied on a so-called internationalist ideology. Here, a short quote from Mao about the Sinified Marxism. He says here, to advocate wholesale westernization is wrong. China has suffered a great deal from the mechanical absorption of foreign material. Similarly, in applying Marxism to China, Chinese communists must fully and properly integrate the universal truths of Marxism with the concrete practice of the Chinese Revolution. Or in other words, the universal truths of Marxism must be combined with specific national characteristics and acquire a definite national form if it is to be useful, and in no circumstances can it be applied subjectively as a mere formula. Chinese culture should have its own form, its own national form. So here you go. This is the way Marxism had been sinified, adapted to Chinese surroundings and circumstances. And the sinification means that Chinese intellectuals mean mostly something very different when they use Western terms of political philosophy. Giving you a few examples here, like on the screen. When the Chinese intellectuals talk about dialectics, they have something different in mind. They don't usually refer to Hegel's dialectic. They refer to yin-yang thought and such things. Materialism, they refer to the notion of qi and whatever. State, something different than in Hegel's idea. Opening up is also different. And Marxism is something different. Democracy is something different. They mean something very different when they use these terms. And not knowing that leads to a lot of kind of frustration and confusion. If you know that they mean something different, then you have no problems understanding what the Chinese are meaning. Yeah. Now the question is why the Chinese intellectuals have embraced Marxism so eagerly. There are certain similarities, of course, between Confucianism and Marxism. Just giving you a few hints, people as basis, the Minmen Zixiang, the world as one community, the small prosperity as a pragmatic goal. In Neo-Confucianism, you always had public interests being before private or egoistical interests. And then if you consider that the term communism, if you retranslate that from its Chinese version into English, like a 共产主义, means actually common propertyism. Common propertyism. That's the basic meaning of 共产主义, of Chinese communism. And just think about the world as one community, common property. Mao's key slogan, to serve the people, people-based thought and all. The cult around Mao in the early decades of People's Republic, he was treated like a sage ruler, is venerated in Confucianism. And then a second important reason was that the Chinese intellectuals thought they had adopted the most progressive Western thought after the Russian Revolution. I give you here a quote of one of my great favorite columnists of the former International Herald Tribune, William Pfaff, who passed away unfortunately a couple of years ago. He said, mind you, that Marxism, Leninism was largely also Lenin's theory of imperialism that was added to Marx thought. Now, William Pfaff has this to say: the leaders of China made use of Marxism-Leninism, a progressive Western millenarian and revolutionary ideology that promised to be able to transport society into a new age far in advance of not only the established and seemingly reactionary kingdoms and cultures of Asia, but of the bourgeois capitalism and imperialism of the existing West as well. Thus, the Chinese, Vietnamese, and other modern Asian communist movements were inspired to believe they could, so to speak, leap over the imperialist and capitalist stages of Marx's historical and revolutionary scheme to arrive in a postmodern future through adoption of Marxist-Leninist doctrine and organizing communist societies. I think that captures it very, very well. Yeah, the thinking of the intellectuals, Chinese intellectuals at that time. And you also have to keep in mind that there are certain similarities in both teachings. You know, you have the government only through an elite. You know, in Marxism-Leninism was the revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks, the Soviets, and in China the elite was the Confucian officials. Both were oriented towards practice and society. Both lack interest whatsoever in transcendent or religious issues. You could call both civil religions. Yeah? I put a question mark, could discuss that. Yeah? You have certain religious elements in Confucianism. Yeah? After all, Confucianism is a moral teaching. Yeah? From that I mean, I've been brought up Catholic, just like most of you, I suppose. And for us, the Christian teaching was moral teaching, most of all, moral teaching. Yeah. So from this perspective, there's a certain equivalent. You have Confucian temples, you have rituals, you have a state cult, you have canonical scriptures. And in Indonesia, just talked to the ambassador before. I was there 2 years ago at a conference that stressed the religious aspect of Confucianism. After all, Indonesia is the only country in the world that recognizes Confucianism as a religion. Yeah? And this religion is practiced by the overseas Chinese in Indonesia. Yeah? And but it's not Confucius is their god that they kind of worship. The god is Tian. Yeah? They pray to Tian, to the heaven, Yeah? But this is only at the side. There are other Confucian elements in Chinese Marxism. The great opponent of Mao all the way through the Cultural Revolution was Liu Shaoqi. He had this interesting book that he wrote in the Yan'an period on the self-cultivation of a communist. Yeah? Self-cultivation, Xiaoyang, that's a moral self-cultivation. Yeah? So he combines notions of Confucianism with communism. And here, I don't know if I should go into this, it might be a little long, but only to point out religious elements in Marxism-Leninism. Yeah? The perceptions of history, that you have a primordial society, which is paradisical, and then you have kind of millenarian visions, expectations. The revolution must come. Yeah? Marx and Engels believed that they would experience the revolution in their days. It had to come. Yeah? Just like the Christians were expecting in the Middle Ages the coming of Christ. Yeah? You have the sacralization of leaders. You had a kind of a trinity with Marx, Engels, and Lenin. You had sacred canonical scriptures, like one of the great social democrats in the German history, August Bebel. He talked about the capital of Karl Marx as the Bible of the workers' movement. Yeah? You had cults about the red flag. You had a working class as God's chosen people, as like the Israelites. Ferdinand Lassalle, another great German social democrat, he says, it is the rock on which the church of today shall be built. Yeah? You had martyrs of the movement. You had moral conduct that was comparable. Poverty was, in a way, virtuous. Wealth was vice. Yeah? You had faith as obedience towards the teaching of the party as well as to the church. And last but not least, sadly, so to speak, the killing of heretics, unbelievers, enemies of the movement for a good purpose. That not only started under Stalin, as you all know, but it began already under Lenin. And here also illustrating church windows on the right-hand side in Berlin in the GDR State Building. And you could characterize Marxism-Leninism as a secular belief system. You're a great philosopher. I don't know if you still read him. I got a lot of good stuff from reading Leszek Kolakowski. He described it as a soteriology, a teaching for mankind's self-salvation from worldly misery. Yeah? That's the way Kolakowski described Marxism-Leninism. Yeah? And only at the end of this section, a bon mot that I'd like to also stress when I'm in China. You know, Karl Marx is said to have said, religion is the opium for the people. And the great French thinker of the early 50s and 60s, Raymond Aron, he says, Marxism, it's the opium of the intellectuals. Anyway, so much about that. What about Confucianism in the frame of Marxist politics in China today? You have today, of course, a central unitary state in the continuity of the empire. Michael Aglietta, he stressed the Chinese Communist Party has restored the legitimacy formerly personified by the emperor. So now you have also Confucius regained from the ashes. He's been revered now as a great national hero. Yeah? And you have political goals with reference to Confucian ideas, namely the realization of a society of small prosperity by the year 2021. Why 2021? Well, that will be 100 years of the founding of the Communist Party in China. And you want to have a harmonious society and also a harmonious world by the year 2049. Why that? Because that's also 100 years since the founding of the People's Republic of China. So you have today an affirmation of the Chinese cultural tradition, in particular of Confucianism, and that is quite contrary to the Maoist period. Yeah? You have a regaining, in a way, of a cultural self-consciousness in China today. And you also have a widespread consensus that Marxism, however the Chinese interpreted it and signified it, has brought China ahead. And the government, through the Chinese Communist Party, I said that already, is on the one hand a continuation of a meritocracy. Yeah? It's a rule of a self-declared ideological elite. The Chinese Communist Party considers itself as an elite organization. And you also cannot just easily get into, become a member. It's not like when you want to hear like what parties do you have here, like Peace Party or whatever. You probably go to their office and sign a application form, and there you are, then you're a member. But that doesn't work with the Chinese Communist Party. You're being screened everywhere. Your colleagues and your fellow students will be asked and whatever. And it is also led in the style of a traditional secret societies. It's a kind of a sworn brotherhood. Yeah, when you enter the Communist Party, you have to swear. Yeah, it's a solemn oath that you kind of share their ideals and everything. Yeah, so it's not an easy thing to become a member. And you can, of course, ask if this is a conscious or unconscious instrumentalization of politically motivated reconstruction of a tradition, or if it is more or less unconscious continuation of a tradition on behalf of the CCP, but just under different conditions. Is it possibly an internalization of Confucian concepts of order, political order? I've talked to many Chinese colleagues, and some of them have stressed that the top leadership of China, they are to the bone kind of filled with Confucian concepts of moral and order. Yeah. So this is what they say. Never know if it's true. Anyways, so that leads me to my last section now, and then I'm finished. Confucianism and democracy. So I point already out that Confucianism is compatible with democracy. It's certainly a government for the people, yeah? Because the people are the basis. But democracy, the way we define it, is a European or American tradition stemming from the old Greeks, but with a global normative impact. I stress normative impact. Today, like our governments, when they deal with countries in Africa or whatever, they only want to make business with them when they are democratic in our understanding. So this is the normativity of it. Yeah. So you have, of course, favorable preconditions for successful democracies. Like when you have a middle class that wants participation, as happened in Taiwan, as happened in South Korea. But also favorable conditions is own respective traditions. If you have a certain culture of contention, culture of contention is because when we have elections, we have election campaigns. You know, that is a culture of contention. You have you're battling, yeah. And if that is a kind of a strange notion, then you have problems. And Professor Gawlikowski has already pointed out, you know, China didn't develop to our own expectations. We thought that according to average modernization theories, that the development of capitalism in China would necessarily end in a democracy according to our standards. Fukuyama, Francis Fukuyama, end of history and all that type of stuff, you know. So that has, of course, proved wrong. It has proved wrong. And then one also has to kind of keep in mind that there are different traditions in China and in the Far East. You have, as I said already now a couple of times, the rule through an educated official elite, the meritocratic tradition. You have also a tradition of political tutelage, the Xunzheng teacher, yeah, that you had. This began in modern China with Sun Yat-sen. He had that established. It's basically a dictatorship for the purpose of development and for modernization. It's political tutelage. You had that in Taiwan, you have it to a certain extent in Singapore, you have it to a certain extent in Hong Kong still as well. And then you have also the tradition that Professor Gawlikowski mentioned, the tradition of political consultation, consultative politics, the Zhengxie. China has two chambers, like the British have the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The Chinese have the Renda, you know what you call it again, the People's Congress, and then you have as a second chamber you have the chamber for political consultation, and it is kind of filled with people that are respected in the populace as being of having merits through education, through their engagement in public affairs and all, and they are being consulted. They are being consulted. So this is a very interesting difference to our Western tradition. So now let me ask if Western experience and models could be a blueprint for China. And for this purpose, I looked into one very, very influential book by Michael Sandel. I don't know if you're familiar with Michael Sandel. He's one of the pop stars in political philosophy. He is in Harvard, and he fills not only one audience with his lectures, but a couple of audiences, and his lectures are being posted over the whole world by YouTube and everything. And I was a couple of years ago in Shanghai at a conference when we looked into the influence on Sandel's thought in China, and he was there himself. And he had this book, Democracy's Discontent, America in Search of a Public Philosophy. I don't want to get into too much detail for time reasons. He stresses that the United States was not founded upon liberal principles as we see it today, but rather on civic republican principles. Civic republican principles and republican virtues. And he defines the civic republicanism as deliberating with fellow citizens about the common good and helping to shape the destiny of the political community. So he stresses self-government in community, although what we understand today as communitarianism. He is a great thinker of the communitarian tradition now. And we have to kind of, or we notice when we read this book that he talks about a very specific American model embedded in an American narrative. The background of the American democracy was quite different from that of Europe. Have a distinct American history. You have a political experience, the settling of Europeans in a continent inhabited by native peoples, and also the history of slavery. Interestingly, in his book, Sandel doesn't talk about these two things, though. About the history of slavery, he doesn't talk about the native people. It's like talks about American democracy as fallen from the sky, and there it is, you know. The wiping out of the original population is not a topic for American intellectuals. This is something that we should keep in mind when we talk about human rights and all these type of things, anyways, there are considerable differences to European political histories and experiences. Michael Sandel says the United States never was a nation state in the European sense. And I say, what about non-European societies? Anyways, you have developments in China that are quite different. Here is one influential intellectual. His name is Yu Keping. He came up with a book that's called Democracy is a Good Thing. Yeah, and he points out the sprouts of democracy, inner party democracy, the ordered transition of power to the most capable, and things like that, elections for the local people's congresses. And interesting though, and important, is that Yu Keping is not calling for a replica of Western democracy, but for a type of democracy that matches China's reality. So for him, democracy is good governance. It's rule of uncorrupt technocrats. It's not free civil society as we have it in the West. So from what I read, there seems to be a widespread consensus among Chinese intellectuals that the Western-style representative democracy is not an option for China. This is not my opinion, mind you. This is the way I perceive Chinese intellectuals' opinions. No option for China. What's the will of the people? Is that the will of peasants? After all, we have about 600 million peasants in China, migrant workers, yeah, 移民工. Yeah, you have the question of the education of the people, yeah, and so you have the consensus that only an elite is apt to address the concerns of the people. So Chinese model gives priority to a strong state and to a stable system. And interesting for China when we compare it to Western concepts, that they have long-term goals, long-term planning, long-term, because they don't have elections every 4 years and government changes and then something completely different comes on the agenda. They have long-term goals and long-term planning. So poverty alleviation is a major achievement and a major goal in the Chinese system. And a lot of people acknowledge that in a reform period now 40 years, China has achieved a tremendous goal, has alleviated about 400, 500, maybe some people 600 million people out of absolute poverty. This is something tremendous, something like that never happened in history before. And of course you have now in China some individual liberties, you have some rights, you have some leeway for civil societies, but the legitimacy of the rule is the efficiency in performance of the state. The private interests are behind the interests of the nation. And Christopher Herlin, he described it in a recent book as a responsive authoritarianism. Responsive authoritarianism. What does it mean? It means it is an authoritarian system, but it is kind of capable to learn, to respond to the differences. It adapts. Yeah, that's a responsive authoritarianism. So we might talk about a democracy with Chinese characteristics, and we might ask the question, will there be a distinct form of democracy in China, adapted to Chinese circumstances, with a Chinese face, oriented along cultural peculiarities, using own cultural resources, in analogy to the Sinicized Marxism of Mao, and, mind you, previously the Sinicized Buddhism. The Chinese had the sinification of Marxism was not the only sinification that occurred in the history of Chinese thought, but Buddhism was transformed completely when it came from India to China. Also adapted to Chinese circumstances, taking up Taoist thought, leading to Zen Buddhism, Chan Buddhism and all. So what will be the future goal? Is it maybe a leftist Confucianism, a mix of Confucianism, Marxism, and democracy? I don't have a crystal ball, so I cannot really tell the future, unfortunately. But somewhere along these lines, we will probably go. So the way I see it, China's search for its own political way must suit its situation as a continent with geographical characteristics, and also has enormous population, its history, its problems, its culture, Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism. And the way I see it, the Chinese intellectuals have already, since the beginning of the modern China, since the Opium Wars, have been striving for political autonomy. They are looking for a good mixture of Chinese and Western elements. They have learned a lot from the West and have incorporated an awful lot from the West, not just only from Marxism thought from Trier, but a lot of other things. And they're trying to kind of combine that. And the nucleus of the traditional Chinese system, as Michael Aglietta describes it, it was a bureaucracy controlled according to the ethical principles of Confucianism. And for that reason, he also stresses that in the future, whatever happens, ethics must take over in the choice and the reproduction of elites. This is important. So, seen from this perspective, we find a certain relevance of Michael Sandel's book For Democracy in China. The political systems develop specifically from a local and historical setting, and in China as well. Here, a quote from Sandel's book. He says, "The loss of the capacity for narrative would amount to the ultimate disempowering of the human subject. For without narrative, there is no continuity between present and past, and therefore no responsibility, and therefore no possibility of acting together to govern ourselves." So I come to my conclusion. I ask if it makes sense to apply queries of the Confucian tradition to problems of the Chinese presence, particularly of ethical queries of the Confucian tradition. And here I come back to certain thoughts that I introduced to you in my talk before, and I show that there are traditional lines of conflict that have relevance today as well. I talked about the world as one community versus the world as a family inheritance. This can be addressed to the question, what is the welfare all about? Is it welfare for the welfare of the people, or is it the well-being of a few rich people, or of party members, party cadres? It addresses questions of corruption and all. I talked about, only mentioned it briefly though, to take responsibility for the well-being of the whole world. 以天下为己任, yeah. What about that? Take responsibility for the well-being of the whole world, or take responsibility only for the well-being of the own nation? This addresses questions of nationalism. It addresses questions about conflicts, about sea territories, but also problems in global ecological goals, climate change and everything. I talked about harmonious society. Will it be a society with more social justice? Will it lead to the narrowing of the gap between the poor and the rich? Will it lead to solving conflicts with national minorities, like such as Tibetans, the Uyghurs, Mongolians and such? Humane government, 仁政, or the way of the hegemon? This addresses questions of adhering to the law, adhering to constitution, or using arbitrary rule, the way of the hegemon. It addresses questions of how to treat political dissidents and such. And last but not least, the CCP, is it a real meritocracy? Does it deserve that name? Or is more the tradition of secret societies more kind of valid, that addresses questions of transparency, accountability, rule of law, and all that. And this is now my last slide, my conclusion. If a democracy, according to Western standards, if that is the best solution for a country with a population of 1,400 million people, is for me a very big open question. Particularly since the problems that China has match the or correspond to the magnitude of the population figures. So what the future chance of present model China might be concerned, they might not be worse, the way I see it, if China would orient itself along its own traditional ethical resources. might not be worse if China would be able to carefully reconstruct or expand its existent meritocracy in the direction of good governance, just or humane government, and rule of law. So, from this point of view, I would say the ability to solve traditional tensions might also very well determine China's future fate. Thank you very much that you listened for me to such long.
Thank you very much for Thank you very much for so splendid presentation of so complex problems. We enjoy all of your explanations. So now we may pass to discussion part. So please sit for a moment and rest a moment, and I will ask our participants to pose the questions or opinions. There are many ideas, many problems you pointed out. So I agree that question marks are necessary, since we can't make definite conclusions how the situation will develop. But the general direction that Confucianism is still a basis for future development, that I completely agree with you. Good, please. You are the first. Please come here, then our viewers could see you. Please, on this small carpet.
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, my name is TC. I'm now a doctoral student at the Polish Academy of Science, but my field is not sinology. I'm in the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology. So it could be a little contrast. It's interesting how you from Germany, you're studying Chinese philosophy, and I come from Taiwan. And I'm here, I'm focusing on Frankfurt School. Well, two brief questions. It seemed to me your whole lecture could feel like a whole school year of program. So it's very amazing work. And
1 year, that would be perhaps not sufficient.
yes,
perhaps 3 years.
Honestly, for me, it
studies.
summarizes my compulsory education, in a sense, especially how this, how they call it Confucianism education in Taiwan. And well, let me elaborate a little bit how I feel my experience of Confucianism education. It's seeming to me we've come to a point where my experience in Taiwan and Poland is very similar, where the communism is taboo. So I don't know if I can speak on behalf of like my society if I don't understand communism, but it seems to be a new taboo here to speak of communism in Poland. I mean, there's the government, and then there are the anti-government who thinks, they don't agree with the interpretation of communist past. Anyway, I would like to ask you your understanding of the context when Confucianism, 2,500 years ago, when it started, and the context of Confucianism influence in the pre-20th century. There's a modernizational period, but in the past, how it became what you call dominant thought. I mean, I would have a different I wouldn't call it dominant. To me, seems to me when people call like East Asia, call it Confucianism society, it seems to me a little bit of Orientalism. It's like calling Polish society Catholic society. I'm a little skeptical because maybe I'm too young. So I think it would be maybe for people's interest to know, to my understanding, the period of time, 春秋战国, that time, when all different thoughts were coming up, it seemed to me very much like the Greek time. People were they were salespersons of political ideas. They were trying to convince different states what is the best way to rule. And that's my understanding of, it was not only Confucianism. So I don't know how you, and if, very briefly, the second question, at the very end you were trying to, trying to merge two schools of thought and see its present relevance. And one of the very important question is the concept of justice. And you're speaking of the challenge of modern time, but I think what would be interesting is to hear what you think of the theory of justice in terms of Confucianism tradition. So.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, very interesting.
I hope. It would be very long to answer everything. But
Yeah. I will try to be brief. I also cannot answer everything. Well, first of all, the one of your questions was like, maybe call China a Confucian society. You referred to Confucianism as a beginning, like in the first 500 years before Christ, and all the other influences of Taoism and Buddhism and all. And today was the influence of the West. Can we call Poland still a Catholic society and all? Today, of course, we cannot anymore. We're living in a so-called post-modern period, right? Today, everything goes, anything goes. All the hierarchies have been kind of being plowed under. But when you look at things from a statistical point of view, then I think you can still come to a kind of a careful conclusion. The way I see it, what makes China different, what also makes Chinese behave differently, think differently and all, is the long influence of Confucian thought. I think that's the major influence in the Chinese tradition. And it is, in a way, just like in Western political thought, that our tradition begins with the Greek philosophers. It begins with Greek practice of democracy. And this is being continued until today. Yeah? It, of course, has been a long period of time where there was no democracy practiced. But when the Americans started with it again, they referred to this tradition. They explicitly referred to that tradition. And so we have a history that is shaped by our leading ideologies, such as Greek philosophy, but also the Christian teaching. The Christian teaching has been a tremendous influence on Western thought. I mean, after all, people have pointed out that even the major thoughts of liberal Western thought, they all go back to Christian roots. Yeah, you can kind of trace them back to Christian origins. But the thing is that Christian teachings have been secularized, has been kind of changed into a secular environment. And for that reason, the Christian origin is not easily recognizable anymore today for most people. Yeah? That's one of the things. So for that reason, you can also still call Polish society, what makes Polish society different from, let's say, German society or from French society? It is the long influence of the Catholic Church here, I would say. Yeah, I don't know Poland that well, but the way I see it from the outside, that would make sense to me. So the other question was about Confucian justice. Confucian justice, that's a very complicated issue. The Confucian justice actually gives also consideration to relationships. you know. Like our concept of justice, for example, the modern concept of justice, referring to John Rawls, you know, a theory of justice, is functions the way he described it, under the veil of ignorance. You must not know about relationships. You know, if I want to be really just, I must not know that I'm a friend of Professor Gawlikowski's. Yeah, but the Chinese Confucian concept of justice considers relationships, and that, of course, conflicts with our Western ideas. And there is one field where Chinese ideas stressing relationships, how that will kind of harmonize, and how that will eventually come together with Western concepts of justice. I see there as a conflict. I don't know how this conflict will be solved in the long run, but you have the conflict of, on one hand, universal rules that are being kind of applicable to everybody, and on the Confucian side, Chinese side, the importance of relationships. I have to consider in which context justice is being kind of carried out. Yeah, it's also an important idea. I mean, even in our idea of justice, I'm not supposed. If my father or my son has done something, I, as their relative, I can abstain from testimony. I can abstain from taking part in a court case, you know, because of my relationship. So we also value relationships to a certain extent, but not in the way the Chinese do it. Anyway, so you have here a certain tension, and we have to wait and see how this tension will kind of be solved in the long run.
If you allow me, I would like to add something about communism. Communism in China and communism in Poland. I would suggest to make the essential distinction between those two things. Communism in Poland was imposed on a free nation by our neighbor, by the Soviet Union, Russia for us. And as you know, Poland was divided into three parts. For more than 100 years, we were under Russian rules and so on. So, and Polish mentality, this equality, freedom of individual, lack of any communal life, village communities, and so on. So communist ideas were in contradiction with our heritage. And moreover, it was imposed by the old, let's say, colonial power on us. So there was the conflict with our national identity. In China, you got this close relationship of communism and Chinese traditional heritage, Confucianism. And please remember that at several instances, Mao Zedong made equal Tatung society, this great unity society, with communism. That for him, it was the same. And as I agree with Professor Paul, that communism in China was interpreted in a Chinese way, in quite Confucian way. That was not communism which arrived to Poland, not communism which was used by French communists or Italian communists. That was different communism, simply. So we are using the same name, communism in Poland, communism in China, but actually they're completely different social phenomena. So I would like to emphasize that. And your questions are very interesting, but I suppose that in order to answer your questions, then we have to organize 1 year seminar and to meet every week for a seminar. Then we could discuss all of that. And the idea of justness, that is my impression, may be wrong. I don't know what Professor Paul would say. I would say that in Confucianism, there was no idea of justness. Going a little bit along your recommendation, yes, perhaps the just is that what I should do according to the rules. Yes, if there are 5 relations, so it is just that wife is listening the opinion of husband. That is just. Yeah. It is just when elder brother is taking care of younger brother. And younger brother has to listen the elder brother. When my sister divorced, my Chinese friends were asking that, how could you allow your sister to take this bad husband? She should ask you as elder brother, do you accept this husband? And you are saying that you had doubt about this husband from the very beginning, how it could be possible. She should listen to elder brother. That was just. Yeah. So our ideas of justness and Confucian concept of justness, they are completely different. Has nothing in common with Greek philosophy, perhaps.
There is a standard quote that is being kind of used in that context to illustrate the Confucian justice. It's in the Analects, the Nelunu. Yeah? Nelunu, there is that passage where Confucius receives a visitor from another state, one of these small states, Qi or Lu or whatever, can't remember. And he says, in my country, people are really exercise justice. When a son has stolen a sheep, then the father will kind of go to the magistrate and tell him that you should punish the son and all, And Confucius responds to that, well, in where I come from, we have a different type of justice. Here, the father covers up for the son and does not accuse him. Yeah? So the covering up for relatives, is that's why I'm saying, you're shaking your head. That's why I'm saying this is the Confucian tradition, to value relationships more than principles such as justice, abstract principles. As I said, John Rawls, in his great theory of justice, he says that he talks about this veil of ignorance that one has to have in order to exercise justice. The veil of ignorance, I hope you understand what he means. I kind of must not see how I'm related to anybody. Then only can I exercise justice. Yeah? And the Chinese concept is just the opposite. I do have to consider. Yeah. But as Professor Gawlikowski pointed out, this has also there's some reason to that. There's some, and as I pointed out in the saying in our judicial system, we also make room for that. Yeah. But we don't give it as much room as the Chinese do. Yeah. So I don't know if you can live with that answer. Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
Please, of course. Oh, please come here, please. Otherwise, our viewers of internet could not see you.
It would sound embarrassing, but my educational background, I was actually more of communist leaning. And the impression I had coming to Poland, I was like, I'm coming here to learn communist ideas. And now when I speak to my professor, they're all like, what are you talking about? No one is touching those things. Like what you said, it's something imposed. But one thing I find it very at home here is when you speak of transitional justice. I don't know if you, Mr. Lech Wałęsa, he's a famous figure in Taiwan because, you know, he was the one that when Taiwanese politicians come, they have to visit him. And they don't know that this guy has been, you know, running into other scandals here. The thing is, I don't know if I can speak on behalf of like Chinese experience because, you know, we have our new democracy, you know, 96, year 2000, first election. And it has been, in terms of social atmosphere, there has been a new, it's like a challenge to combat what this Confucianism teaching in our upbringing and the ideas of democracy and the concept of what transitional justice is, like obedience, you know, everything needs to be covered up. But at the same time, you know, now 20 years on, I have been hearing suspicions of what we've been taught, of what Confucianism is. If what we learn in school, Confucianism, has not been cherry-picked by the intellectuals that were adhering to the government. So here is, I was trying to look up one of my friend, an editor. He was trying to revisit some of this like Confucius writing. I believe 大同篇 is from the book of rituals, yeah? Li Ji. So I think there's a little confusion between what ritual is. Like one of the main idea of Confucianism is the importance of rituals. You follow the rituals, you are safe, yeah? But if it's only pragmatic or there are some, you know, how do you call this, moral support behind, that's two different ways of practice, yeah? There are people following the rituals just for the sake of following. But then the ones who wrote the book, they were trying to give reasons to it. So here, speaking of like, when I grew up, we used to say 五伦, yeah, always relationship. It's always relationship to family, friends. But here is a quote from what it is to speak of a revenge. What happens if you have a revenge to make? So if it's somebody did harm to your parents, a revenge, no matter if it's related to public responsibility, you have to let anything down. No matter what political, you know, you work in the government, no matter what position you're in, if it's something that the harm is done to your parents, you have to take revenge. If you run into your enemies on the street, you know, someone who did great harm to you, even if you have nothing in your hand, you would try to beat him. You would try to kill him. And if it's something that the harm is to your brothers, your close friends, well, it's not as great as harm to your parents. So you finish your responsibilities. If you work in the government, if you work in a company, you finish your public responsibilities, and then you respond. So, I mean, it's the explaining. My friend's interpretation is that justice is to be honored, but it's not something that's absolute. How it should be taken care of, there are the timings and the methods. So, I mean, it's coming from personal experience that we're trying to reverse the traditional teaching. Like, I mean, there were the Neo-Confucianism from early 20th century on, but that has been staying very much in academia. But in terms of like, you know, modern political life, it's something that we're battling now. So,
I mean, let me just only briefly respond to that now. I don't want to take too much time for that question. I only want to point out that we are living in a transitional period now, and concepts such as justice, who are very important in the West, will be adapted to Chinese surroundings, Chinese circumstances, will be sinified in a way too. And how the Chinese will come to grips with that, with the Western ideas, how they will kind of deal with that, that's the future will decide, Of course, the importance of relationship also touches questions of corruption and all, and that all has to be considered. Yeah? So we don't know what the future will bring, but we can certainly say that the Confucian tradition, the Chinese tradition, was such that it valued more relationships than a kind of the universal principles of justice. And after all, today we have also a kind of a reinterpretation of justice. These days, the form of justice that's mostly talked about today is social justice. Social justice is something that has never been part of the original idea of justice. Yeah? When Aristotle and Plato and all these people, and also Kant, when they talked about justice, they were not thinking about social justice. But today you hear justice only being talked about in the context of social justice. Okay, but maybe there's another question here.
Do I have to? Yes, please.
So
Otherwise,
Professor,
nobody could see you.
I'm Marta Tomczak from Polish Academy of Sciences, Institute of Political Studies. Thank you very much. To me, it was an extremely interesting lecture. Just two ideas very briefly. I think that the Confucianism, which is kind of more dense in the meaning, and the real Confucians in more dense meaning, facing the Western concepts, these were those of the late 19th century. When I think of, for example, people like Kanye West, reading about the Western ideas, then I think, oh, it's a Confucianist who reconsiders foreign ideas and thinks what's good for them, what's not. Well, you mentioned that your Chinese fellow professors say that the party members are deeply Confucian in the way they think. I think they are Confucian the way the Chinese society is today, which means the concept probably lost a lot of its essence. We don't know to which degree. It's probably the same with democracy here. So at the very beginning of the concept, it was dense in meaning, we cherish, I think. But what we come out lately with it's just really not that deep. And we kind of reconsider what it really should be, because we don't like it right now, yes? My question would be, why do you think Chinese, especially like government members, party members, why do they stick to the concept of democracy? Why do they use the world? Because like my first idea was, okay, the world is talking about it. America all the time raises the concept, so they have to prove that they have it as well. It's just that it is of totally different meaning. For example, you mentioned Jacobin, yes? So he says something totally different about democracy. But is it the real reason? What is it that they are so enchanted with? They could say, we don't like the concept, we have our own. And then just they could stop talking about Minzuzhui, but they all the time bring it in different, constructions, in different talks, in books. Why do they do it?
Well, I mean, it is the particular background of what I talked about, Minbenzsicherung, the people. Democracy means you're actually ruled by the people, right? Means ruling of the people, or whatever, ruling the people rules. Yeah. I try to point out that this idea of the importance of the people in the Chinese context did not lead to what we have in the West, that that the people themselves rule in the end, but that they have kind of representatives that rule for them, right? And why do they still cling to that idea? Why do they not kind of choose a different term for it? You know, I don't know, but it's just with all the other ideas too. You know, they should also use a different term for Marxism because they imbued it with completely different ideas. You know, they should use a different term for Buddhism because they made a completely new thing out of it. Yeah, and they're still using these terms. Yeah.
The word democracy is particularly troublesome.
Sorry?
But the word democracy
Yeah.
is particularly troublesome
Yeah.
to them, yes, because at least today in
Yes.
the political discourse.
Yeah. Yeah, I know it leads to a lot of misunderstanding, to a lot of frustration, because we talk about democracy in China and say, well, you're not making any progress. And the Chinese say, well, we have democracy. We give weight to the people. We consult the people. We make government for the interest of the people. We give them a better livelihood. We try to do poverty alleviation. That is real kind of government for the interest of the people. So it's like a friend of mine once described the dialogue between China and the West as the dialogue of what we call of dumb people. Dumb, you know, when you don't hear, right? Dialogue of dumb people, you don't hear. You just kind of you kind of reiterate what you think, and the other party reiterates its view too. But you kind of, in German we say aneinander vorbeireden. Now I don't know what the term is in English too, Linda. What you say, aneinander vorbeireden? To talk without the other part listening, right? Without kind of coming across with understanding. You just have your own view of an issue, and you present it that way, and you don't get together that way. I'll take the heads back.
A moment, I would like to add something to that. When you say democracy, all the time you understand democracy in our Western sense. But please remember that when the Chinese are speaking democracy, they are not using English. They use Chinese. And in Chinese, they are speaking about Minzhu Zhuyi. Minzhu, it means people are the hosts. In Confucian mentality, it is very essential division between host and the guest. When you are coming to a certain home, you should follow all the rules of the host. 客人要听主人. So, when before unification of Hong Kong with China, when they were studies, what is attitude of Hong Kongese, Chinese from Hong Kong to democracy, almost everybody supported democracy. But when Chinese University of Hong Kong made more detailed questions, according to the answers of Chinese from Hong Kong, 82% accepted as a best model of democracy, democracy of the father and of the people. So the authorities should rule like a good father, and the people should be treated as good children. That was the relation. That's the essence of democracy, according to the Chinese in Hong Kong, who were for 100 years under British rule. So, what could you expect about understanding of democracy as procedures, as a rule of law, and multi-party democracy, and so on, from a Chinese peasant, from Shantung, let's say? You can't expect anything of that kind. For him, democracy is Minjujui. That's obvious. Every more or less educated Chinese understood this term.
Yeah,
in
it
his
is
way.
like basically our idea of democracy is one man, one vote. You know, that's we define democracy, and that's not the Chinese way of seeing it. No? But there's a gentleman there in the back. Who, yeah, next. Yeah, you wanted to say something too.
Thank you for your. Sorry.
Mr. Ayur, please come here.
Mhm.
Yes.
My name is Ayur Janaev. I'm from University of Warsaw Institute of Department of Applied Social Sciences. I would like just to, could you explain me my doubts, something that I cannot understand, at least have difficulties, connected with the title of your presentation, which is comparing Confucianism to Marxism and democracy. Should we understand Marxism as something different from democracy, or at least ideologically, Marxism was not something authoritarian and also proclaimed some rights, emancipation, equality. So how should we deal with these terms, and why did not use some other terms like communism, yeah, or it's more about terminology that you are using about Western society. So could you explain it more?
Mm.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. Why did I use these terms? Confucianism, democracy, Marxism, because according to my view, these are the ideological bits and pieces that have been most influential for Chinese presence. Mind you, democracy was a big issue in the so-called May 4th movement. The May 4th movement, one of the slogans was Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy, you know, 思现场 and 的现场, you know, like, for the traditional Chinese society, Confucian society, the Western society, which was ruled by the people, the way Abraham Lincoln says it, you know, for the people, of the people, by the people, was a fascinating idea. Had made a big impact on China, but it had been superseded by concepts of Marxism that came to China at the same period. After all, May 4th movement was the period when both democratic ideas as well as communist Marxist ideas entered China. For that reason, and because democracy, as I pointed out in one of my slides, today has an enormous normative impact in international politics. You know, I mentioned, you know, like when African countries and all, like the Americans, the way they see it, of course they are different. You know, when Saudi Arabia is not democratic, they kind of turn away. You know, and because it's the allies and all and all, but basically for European countries, it is a very, very important issue, and you can hardly convince anybody in the European intelligentsia that a system like China has any worth by itself. You know, they think, well, it cannot be good because they don't have one man, one vote, basta. Yeah, and it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort to explain to the audience back home that their system is different and has certain benefits. It has the system of one man, one vote would cause probably havoc in China. Giving you an example of a big democracy, it's like India. Look at India. India has about the population figures as China now. It's approaching that, you know, 1,400 million people. Yeah? And you cannot really call it successful. You cannot call it successful. Taiwan is, of course, a different example. Taiwan is I think the population is between 20 and 30 million. and it's a kind of a very small area. It can be governed quite differently. But in China, you have, after all, you have a gigantic part of the populace which are peasants, which are, I wouldn't say illiterate, but they are very little educated. And I think even the citizens, like people that live in cities, the intellectuals, they would threat having a government elected by the priorities of the huge peasantry in the country. Yeah, so but still, I talked about Confucianism, Marxism, and democracy to answer your question or address your question again, because I think these are the major forces that are at work in shaping future China. We have to kind of see how these things come to terms with one another, how they, in which kind of constellation, they will shape the future of China. That's what I try to point out.
I would like to add that during the village elections, which functions in China
Yes,
quite
right.
well, I studied that
Yes.
as much as I could. So the normal practice is that the father of the family is voting for entire family. So father of the family puts the votes for wife, for sons, for daughters, and so on. And as one professor, a lawyer from the People's University told me, actually, in order to put the principle one person, one vote in practice, then we had to send our army to the villages, and just soldiers should bring every member of the family to the elections. Otherwise, it will not function. So it's so obvious that the father is voting for the entire family that it must be simply accepted. This system works. And I may say, as a sinologist who studied Chinese village and Asian villages quite a lot of, in the villages, it was really amazing how those democratic ideas of elections in Chinese villages, how it was developed, how peasants were really using this new system for them of elections against the opinion of the leaders, of the authorities, making a small local revolutions with that. So I can't, because there is no time, to enter into various details, how those elections are carried out in various villages, in various regions, and so on. But that's a real phenomenon in many parts of China. So so we have to follow the realities and see at the realities, not only on the principle, on that what is written in various books, or what Ministry of Interior is imposing the norms, but there are realities. Good. Is there any other question? Yes, please. Please come here.
Thanks. Yeah, I have just one short question concerning the question of soft power, American soft power. It's a new, relatively new term. Do you think China is able to break the American soft power in the future? Because I think that's the condition for ruling the world, actually. Yeah? And I can't really, currently I can't really imagine Chinese cinema, for example, could be popular in the entire, could be popular in the entire world. It's or Chinese language, for example. Yeah, is there any? Do you think it's possible in the next 50 or 100 years that China could become trendy, really trendy? Chinese culture, Chinese language, such like Chinese cinema, for example. Thanks.
Yeah, very good question. On the saying, prognosis or prognostics are always a little difficult, particularly when they concern the future. Never mind the joke. But I only want to say that we don't know what the future will bring. But the issue of soft power is, of course, of tremendous importance. But I also don't know if China wants to rule the world. You know, we have now America ruling the world, also particularly through its soft power. I mean, America rules the world through its military. It rules the world through its finances. It rules the world through its economy. It rules the world through its soft power. You know, English is the dominant language, American English, mind you, and Hollywood movies are being seen all over the world. When we came here, like my wife mentioned to Professor Gawlikowski, when China entered the WTO, the American insisted particularly on two aspects that they wanted to deal with when China entered the WTO. The one was Wall Street, the other one was Hollywood. They wanted that China opens up to the power of its finance system, you know, of Wall Street, and they wanted China to open up to its power to convert the world according to its own standards, that is Hollywood movies and everything else that goes with it. Yeah, they want, like China had a kind of a limitation to Hollywood movies, and Americans wanted that to be significantly increased, so if China will be influential in the future. Well, I only give you an example how things happen unforeseeably. Look at Japan. Like, you have now an awful lot of young students studying Japanese. Like where I am, we have a Japanese department and a sinology department. There are considerably more people studying Japanese. You know why? Because of Japanese popular culture. Japanese popular culture, manga, anime, whatever, Japanese ghost stories and all that type of stuff has become extremely popular among young people. And Japanese movies and series have become very popular in the rest of Asia. So we don't know. Of course, like, soft power is something very, very important, but China has a certain soft power. There is a lot of interest in things Chinese, for example, in Chinese Kung Fu, in Chinese Qigong, in Chinese traditional medicine, in Chinese art and aesthetics. The art market of China is booming in the West and all, you know. And China, the Chinese language, of course, it's tricky, but it's also kind of intriguing. It's interesting to learn Chinese, you know. And in America, apparently, there's a lot of interest in having nannies that teach their children of rich Americans already Chinese, you know. So we don't know where it will lead to, you know. It might gain more soft power, but I think the difference is, though, that China, I really believe that China is not interested in copying the American leadership of the world. The American leadership of the world is something that I consider, the older I have become, I consider it a disaster for the rest of the world. When I was young, I looked up to America. It was for me the Holy Land, you know, and I admired all the singers and songwriters and everything about America, you know, was just for me admirable. But the older I've become, I have seen the influence of America, the political influence of America, the imprint of it, and its politics, its disastrous politics, and interfering everywhere in the world with its military, with its finances, doing, behaving like the bully on the block, pushing everybody around the way they want it. Just the latest thing is about the Iran sanctions, about the oil of Iran and things like that. I find that so catastrophical. Don't want to even talk about it any longer, and I don't think China wants to kind of emulate that example. They want to kind of be on equal footing with the rest of the world. I think that is the goal of China. They want to be taken seriously again. They once were a major force on this planet, and they want to be again a major force. But I don't think that they want to rule the world. That's the way I understand China, from having now dealt with China since how many years now? 50 years almost.
I would like to add something to your explanation, Karl. I would like to add that in my opinion, according to my discussions with various persons leading China, with leaders, my impression is that they underestimate soft power. I discussed with some leaders this problem, presenting them the opinion that they should use much more soft power in order to make the world understand China. I explained many times to Chinese how it is difficult for the Westerners to understand China, starting with the term, democracy is not democracy. Our term of religion does not correspond to the Chinese understanding of religion. Our term of a language, Polish or French language, you can't compare with Chinese language. That's different structure, different complex, and so on. So, and my impression is that until today, Chinese leaders do not understand real significance of soft power, and actually they are used to this idea that all the outside people are looking for Chinese culture. They try to understand that. So let's say we barbarians should learn Chinese arts, Chinese culture, and so on. And Chinese, there is not their duty to teach others of Chinese culture. All other people should be interested in that and should learn it, as it was going on for the last 3,000 years. And the idea that now we have modern equipments, electronic means of communications, that China should work hard in order to teach all those outsiders, I would not say barbarians, of Chinese culture, Chinese tradition, understanding of Chinese society, Chinese transformation, and so on, it seems to me quite a new idea for them, a little bit difficult to accept. And I was discussing about this subject from many Chinese, from professors of the universities through the ministers up to the president of China. So many persons I listen and I discuss with them this issue.
May I just add one thought too about that? I think the future of the Chinese influence on the planet is probably also not decided in Europe or in America, but in other parts of the world, particularly Africa. Africa is the emergent giant You know, it's a sleeping giant, just like China used to be a sleeping giant. And you know, Napoleon already said, when China will awake, you know, it will kind of be something to watch. But when Africa awakes, it will be something to watch too. And how China has been present now in Africa is really amazing. There's a lot of negative reporting about China in Africa, but I've looked into it. I talked to Africans and read about it, you know, from many perspectives. Of course, China is not doing not everything right in Africa. They're making mistakes, but I said already before, it's a responsive type of system. It's a kind of a learning system. They are able to adapt, you know, and they're doing a lot of good things in Africa. One has to say, and they are contributing for this country that has been completely neglected. That first of all been exploited by European powers, you know, mainly England and France and all, and they are contributing, just like with their own poverty alleviation program, they are contributing to the poverty alleviation in Africa. And so we have to watch and see how this is continuing. You know, what will come out of it? How the Americans, what alternatives America or Europeans will have in their engagement with Africa. I believe the future of the Chinese influence on the globe will be determined there and maybe in the rest of Asia and all. You know.
Thank you very much. Is there any other urgent question? If not, then I would like to express my thanks to Professor Paul for his excellent, very fascinating explanations. So now you could appreciate why I insisted and tried so much to invite Professor Paul to come to Warsaw. So I like that he could share his knowledge with our Warsaw public and maybe with other viewers through internet. So thank you very much all the participants of our debate that you arrived here, notwithstanding of this vacation time. And maybe the paper of Professor Paul concerning this topic would appear in Asia Pacific volume 22, which now we are preparing, so to allow you to get more knowledge about that. So thank you very much. I would like to present a small gift from Warsaw in the name of the director Strong of this library, who today could not participate in our debate. So he asked me to present Professor Paul visions of Warsaw from the plane, so that he could not see the Warsaw from above, from the heaven perspective. So now I am giving him, in the name of the library, Warsaw seen from the heaven. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you, very kind.
It's very heavy,
Yes.
unfortunately.
Very nice. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.